Hi, everybody. Welcome again to the Westdale. Really looking forward to tonight. A little bit of a switch here. I'm going to sort of be more doing the host duties that Jeff normally does. Jeff is going to do a film talk about this incredible film, My Winnipeg. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And as you can imagine, there's a lot to talk about with this film. And then once the film talk is over, we actually have a special guest for you as well. Quite a renowned film cinemaphile from Winnipeg, Greg Klymkiw, who is going to be able to share some insights about Guy, about growing up in Winnipeg, about the Winnipeg whole film and culture scene. I think you'll enjoy it quite a bit. So as usual, we have our Q&A, the green button at the bottom. So please add any questions you'd like to ask either Jeff or me or Greg after the talk. This is the third in our Canadian film series, and it's a very special and unique film. And I think Guy Maddin, of course, is one of our great filmmakers, so we just had to include it. So anyhow, enjoy, and I'll see you after the talk. Jeffrey.
Thanks a lot, Fred. So this evening, I'm going to do something slightly different. I'm going to share our slides right from the beginning. And as Fred pointed out, as the talk is going on, but also after the talk, there's going to be a conversation with Greg. And during that time, if you wish to throw your questions and comments, ideas our way using the Q&A function, I will be screening those, and we'll get to just as many of those as we possibly can at the end of the evening. So first of all, I wanted to start this evening's talk with a confession and a disclaimer. First off, after watching tonight's feature film for quite likely the dozenth time in my life, I began to feel like a bit of a fraud, a non-entity, since the closest I've ever been to the heart of the continent, meaning Winnipeg, is Terminal 1 of Lester Pearson International Airport in Toronto on a sunny day in March several years ago. I was heading to Winnipeg on a communications conference, and I was really excited to encounter this city in which my sole education was from watching a documentary, or rather docu-fantasia, as described by its director, in which it had multiple claims to fame, including 10 times the sleepwalking rate per capita in the world. After multiple flight delays, the word cancel appeared proudly in all caps next to Winnipeg on the flight status monitor. The cause? What else? A snowstorm, which lasted for 3 days. So can you imagine my disappointment at not being able to see for myself what the back lane cab ride experience was like as portrayed in this movie, and as well as our esteemed guests write-up on the film. My mantra is totally opposite of the sentiments we hear repeated by the film's version of the director, played by Darcy Fehr. Instead of wondering how to leave it, I'm constantly wondering, how do I enter it? How do I get to Winnipeg at some point? So now that I've got that off my chest, knowing I'm not from Winnipeg, and I know many of you, there are a handful of you that are attending this evening that do have your roots in Winnipeg, would love to hear about your perspectives on what's accurate, what's myth, and what perhaps your own version of Winnipeg might be like. Now to the disclaimer. For those of you who attend our Monday night film talk series faithfully, you will likely notice a method to our program. Typically, we like to begin our talk by providing a spotlight on the director, their life and career. And though I've done some diligent research on Mr. Maddin, I want you just to note that this is the first time we've had a guest in attendance who's intimately familiar with the artist in question. And so as a result, I've purposefully opted to omit some details that I've only learned in print about Mr. Maddin's beginnings and artistic process, in lieu of shifting the podium to our esteemed guest and artist in his own right, Mr. Greg Klymkiw, who we will hear from shortly. This man, he produced the first 3 feature films in Guy Maddin's career. They've been close friends over 30 years. And I think I read, Greg, you said that you were napping pals at one point. So there's no one better than someone who's been in the trenches to tell the stories that I believe he has rightful ownership to. But if you'll permit me, I would love to share just a few details on tonight's featured filmmaker, as well as some personal and shared perspectives on the artistry and genius of Guy Maddin and his masterpiece, My Winnipeg. And of course, I'm even more interested to know what your perspectives are, your questions and your thoughts, and keep those in the Q&A. Number one, born in 1956 to Charles and Herdis Maddin, in the Winnipeg Arena dressing room during a game between the Winnipeg Marines and the Trail Smoke Eaters. If you believe everything in the film, the youngest of 4 children, Guy is quoted often as saying he was brought home on the same day the family got a television set, both laid on the floor at the same time. And reason I bring that anecdote up is that I find it's amusing. It certainly, in the hours of interviews that I've watched, as well as some of the Q&A sessions I've attended at the Tiff Bell Lightbox, this man, Guy Maddin, has a particular sense of humor that is integrated throughout all of his films. And but I also think that this very tiny anecdote illustrates how integral Winnipeg is to Maddin's narrative as an artist, a storyteller, and a person from the day he entered the world. So I mean, imagine he's born in a hockey arena. It doesn't get any more Canadian than that. And of course, weaned on television, that influence that we'll talk about a little bit later. I often wonder at what age Maddin begins to create tales that illustrate his experience. What did his school teachers make of his stories? And for those of you that have watched much of his career and seen many of his pieces of art that are available, by the way, right now there's a big spotlight on the Criterion channel, and that should be there till at least the end of July. So I urge you to go and check out more of his films. But, I just can't think about the kind of mind that creates the wonderful pieces that Guy has brought to the world. As mentioned in the movie, tragedy struck the Maddin family when Guy's brother Cameron killed himself on the grave of a girlfriend who died 6 months earlier. In 1977, his father Chaz died due to complications from a stroke. The reason I bring this up is that these indelible events in his life, they find their way in all of Maddin's films, beginning with his debut short, The Dead Father, from 1985. So Maddin really arrives with a short in the mid-'80s. So he's been around a very, very long time if he happens to be new to some of you. The Dead Father was filmed in 16 millimeter black and white stock, and it's a real early indication of Maddin's aesthetic preferences, which would really take root in his early features, Tales from the Gimli Hospital and Archangel, which I just watched for the first time this weekend and thought it was excellent. And for some reason, he has a real interest in prosthetic legs that I'd like to explore at some point down the road with Greg. But from 1988 and 1990, respectively, and both of those were produced by tonight's guest. Some stylistic examples that I can share for those that are new to Maddin's works, and we'll see some examples in the slides to come, is the way in which he borrows techniques from the past. For example, incorporating things like iris shots, most associated with early silent films. Stage shots of static players, which I heard in an anecdote from him was that in the early years, you didn't see a lot of movement because he was really also trying to figure out how to utilize the camera and how to stage many of his actors. But I think it certainly plays beautifully into the way that he sets up some shots and kind of takes you back into some of that past. The occasional Dutch angle, which I really love, the rear projection shots he utilizes. There's a heavy grain in many of his films, a sort of look of wear and tear. And of course, I'd like to, down the road, talk a little bit about in his later films, like The Forbidden Room, the utilization of emulsified images, really, really trippy stuff. But my favorite touch in his movies are his utilization of intertitles, which if you watch silent films with those little card titles, it kind of give you a little bit of the narrative. But what's interesting about his movies is that he has narration or there's something happening and the intertitles are almost subliminal. They crop up in milliseconds, and which what I find is that they are often whispering to us the true intent of what's in the character's subconscious, or it's there to provide some good laughs as well. But what's imperative is what's behind these stories. So let's talk a little bit about going back to some of the things in my early experience with first experiencing Guy Maddin. Sometime in the early 2000s, I saw my first Guy Maddin movie, The Saddest Music in the World, in Kingston, where I grew up. The first thing that caught my attention was, of course, the style. And so, nothing can be said about the style. And I think, so many times we try to pigeonhole or categorize a director. Maddin is uncategorizable, and it's one of the many, many reasons why I absolutely adore this filmmaker. Is that he does have a style. There is an artifice to what he does, But at the same time, we do see, recurring themes in his films about memory, about dreams. There is an element of melodrama that appears in his films, but by and large, it's really, really hard to be able to basically codify who this person is. Another thing that I really loved about watching these films, and this kind of goes back to saddest music in the world, is that there's a real chutzpah mixed with his art. Maddin was creating worlds that lived in his brain, when where many would debate the need for realism, he totally outright rejects it. The realism is in the emotions that he is able to integrate in the film, that combined with humor. And to me, I don't know, Fred, you might have a unique perspective on this later, but that just seems so uniquely Canadian. And of course, if you can tell a story using the finest art form, why not make it something extraordinary? In the saddest music in the world, and this is a still from that, not from My Winnipeg, we see Isabella Rossellini, in my opinion, one of the most beautiful actresses that ever lived, as a legless beer baroness who's seduced with the gift of a prosthetic glass leg filled with beer. Again, a real Canadian motif, but just to show you this sort of, a bombast that comes through the screen. This is a guy that's saying, I'm going to do whatever the hell I want to do. I'm going to tell the stories that I want to tell. And, he's so unique in that he does get them made. I want to, borrow a quote from Chicago Sun-Times critic Roger Ebert, who wrote of Guy Maddin in his glowing review of My Winnipeg, just to give a taste of a perspective of this fine filmmaker. You will be plunged into the mind of a man who thinks in the images of old silent films, disreputable documentaries, movies that never were, from eras beyond comprehension. His imagination frees the lurid possibilities of the banal. He rewrites history, and when that fails, he creates it. And I really admire how, combined with writer and collaborator in some of these other earlier films, George Tolles, he breaks free from convention to serve his vision. Maddin was quoted as saying, and I really love this, that he delights in bringing mischief to his films. And in My Winnipeg, he was really integrating the mischief full blown. I wouldn't compare him to anyone else, but I find that the same is a spirit in his movies that if I were thinking of other filmmakers that come to mind, certainly not in style, but in spirit, is people like Federico Fellini, David Lynch, and then maybe on a much more of a perverse angle, and I mean that with love, John Waters. There's just guys that create their universes on their own terms. And of course, you take it or leave it. And there are elements of the grotesque that are living in here, but truly there's a lot of heart in the films. So let's dive a little bit more directly into My Winnipeg. My Winnipeg was originally commissioned for the documentary channel, and it was titled Love Me, Love My Winnipeg. Early on, Maddin was challenged by one of his producers, don't give me the frozen hellhole everyone knows that Winnipeg is. And I mean that, I'm just quoting, that's not my perspective. In the past, Maddin has shared the idea that in Canada, we present people as they are, whereas our neighbors to the south build iconic figures into their cultural fabric. At one point, Winnipeg was even referred to as Little Chicago, if you can imagine. So instead of creating a straight-on documentary, Maddin's vision for My Winnipeg was to make up for a couple of centuries of lacking a mythology and apply this principle of storytelling to this third installment of his self-proclaimed Me trilogy, preceded by Cowards Bend the Knee from 2003 and the excellent Brand Upon the Brain, which I believe is also on Canopy, from 2006. This would mean incorporating his own personal history as it intertwines with the facts and the legends of his hometown. Besides, to quote Maddin about documentaries, he said, aren't documentaries about the filmmaker anyway? So to find a point of view, he'd insert himself as a subject who's fighting to regain consciousness throughout the movie in order to leave the city while exploring his relationship with Winnipeg through reenactments with actors who are portraying his family members. Really self-referential stuff. I just absolutely adore it. And he actually films in a place that used to be home. Mixing events with the entertainment and fiction, the movie shows its viewers its point of view with the opening shot. It's the star of the film, Mother, portrayed by Anne Savage, and who many of you will recall from an entry in the film noir series, the B-movie Detour, in which Miss Savage portrays the hitchhiker from hell, Vera, who growled her way through the movie with pure vitriol. She's become something of a folk legend in our house since our viewing of Detour, much sometimes to my chagrin. I'm kind of on the butt end of it sometimes. Maddin opens with a close-up on Savage's face as they do a line reading from a key scene that'll occur later in the film. And you know, Mother is as pervasive as the perpetual changes that are occurring to the city. And she's even referred to later as being somewhat omniscient and clairvoyant. But the reason I mentioned this opening shot is that, you know, Maddin's okay with showing that this is a film. There's no, mincing words about it. I'm doing a line reading with the actress, and there's no matter about having to break any fourth wall or any preconceived ideas around, the narrative of this movie. It's telling us right from the beginning that we're in for something that's going to be very, very different than any documentary you've ever encountered. On a side note, this would actually be Savage's final picture, and I think it's kind of lovely that she had the opportunity to get some of that spotlight later in her long career. We'll talk a little bit more about her later. So as I mentioned before, in trying to find a point of view in this film, in addition to just stating facts about Winnipeg, which could have definitely been a documentary, or a little history on it, instead portraying a version of Maddin. I mentioned Darcy Fehr is a Manitoban actor, with Maddin's actual voiceover narration providing its audience both a geographical, topographical, and anatomical tour of Maddin City. I find this is so fascinating. We see overlapping images of the Assiniboine and Red Rivers and how they form the forks. And there's almost a chant that emerges that influences this discombobulated dreamlike sensation. It's all, he keeps saying Winnipeg in this form of a chant. And he keeps talking about the forks, and the forks over the forks, and the rivers over the rivers, and the arteries. So for me, this dreamlike sensation, which is built early on, the first time I saw this, I almost felt like I was being hypnotized. So I can never remember the sequence of this film, which is kind of lending itself, I think, to that dreamlike environment. I watched the movie a dozen times, and I can never remember the full sequence of the film. Even when I think back on it, there are certain scenes that are not accurate in my memory at all as they're depicted in the film. So, but eventually the forks, this is coming directly from the film, eventually the forks will merge into the lap, the hunted lap, the woolly lap, the lap of my mother, as we're shown a hazy image of a naked groin dissolving into an image of mother. The river is referred to as arteries. And then they even flash an intertitle that says arteries in case you didn't get it. And Maddin's blood runs through his own veins and that of the city. He can't escape. It's almost, at times, it almost felt like a horror film, like a claustrophobic moment, as these guys throughout the film are just constantly falling into slumber on that tram. Lord only knows where they're going. I does recall at one time many, many years ago, I did the same thing on the TTC. I just kept riding and was falling asleep, but I think I had something else going on to cause that to happen. Anyway, I digress. The mythologizing begins then with the talk of a scavenger hunt. So we've got our version of Guy Maddin, who's talking about how I just need to get out and I need to leave. And he's hell bent on leaving. He even says, I have to find a way to leave again. So, we know he's been through this. But the moment that the mythologizing begins with the talk of a scavenger hunt that happens in the city, which the first prize is a ticket out of the city that no one ever cashes in on, and continues to weave its way throughout the film, every time he gets pulled back into the mythology of this Winnipeg. And it keeps him focused on the stories and rather than his want to depart, to leave, to see the world, or to experience something different. Going back to the reference earlier I made of this sleepwalking, this is painting this myth of this incredible city about somnambulism, and I wanted to share some examples of some of those myths, and I think some of you probably will have your own that were your favorites, so please put them in the Q&A because I couldn't cite all of them, otherwise we'd just be watching the movie again. But Maddin paints Winnipeg as an otherworldly place, a dream world, and a direct quote, and because we dream of where we walk and walk to where we dream, we're always lost, befuddled. And, do they blame the biomagnetic influence of the bison? I thought that was fascinating. But I love that regardless, the solution is that the citizens must always take in a sleepwalker. In Winnipeg, it's the law. So first I started doing research into some of these facts, and I thought, Bender, you're totally missing the point. So leave it be and let the mythology sort of grow as you begin to continue to watch this. But the notion of dreams is shared by Maddin in this conversation from earlier this year. And here's a quote. Maddin said, "When I think of how much of my life I've spent just living in my head and traveling back and forth in time, it almost doesn't matter whether that was real or daydreamed or dreamt. It just doesn't matter. That's all the emotional material that's gone into making me and making the people I love around me even more so." And some of that was in reference to the loss of his mother, who passed at the age of 104 in January. And of course, referring back to his relationships with his father, and that, that we can still have these relationships. It can still continue in our dream life, which I'll talk about later. Moving forward, still more of these mythologies. Maddin will intersperse historical facts using stock footage, which I love. In animation and shadow play, Lottie Renninger comes to mind with some of those shadow puppets that she utilized in the silent era. And including this image from a montage about Winnipeg's fabricated Happy Land to supply the documentary. But like a dream, on occasion, he's roused only to realize that he's still riding the streets on the tram. It's really crazy stuff. His solution is that he will film his way out of the city. So for the event that would have been his parents' wedding anniversary, he rents their old apartment at 80 Ellis Drive for a month to shoot reenactments with actors from moments of his life. As he states in the film, he's able to find substitutes who bear uncanny resemblances to the vintage originals, which includes a mound of dirt covered by a rug to represent Dad. Oddly, Maddin says that all are actors except for Mother, which clearly Anne Savage is an actress. So I'm a bit curious to know if anybody has any insight as to his take on that particular point. Also, if you notice, he doesn't include his young self in these actors either. So he's looking in. They recreate things as if they were in 1963-ish. And at this stage, Maddin incorporates still images and presumably Super 8 family movies from his real life. And those are interspersed throughout the film. And I find when I see those, I've never met Guy Maddin. I don't know Guy Maddin, but there's something that I can make an immediate connection to on a very visceral level when I see those in juxtaposition with some of these sort of tall tales that we hear throughout the film. It is absolutely beautiful, and that he would be able to expose himself in that way. I think it's quite a interesting point. It's also worth noting, and then just on a side note, and Greg probably knows far more about this than I do. We might be able to comment on it later, but it's worth noting that in an interview Maddin utilized multiple types of cameras to shoot the film. Super 8, 16 millimeter. He even at one time, and if you consider that this movie was made in 2007, used a friend's cell phone and what must have been a fairly primitive type of video file. But you also notice throughout the film, rear projection is often used, and they're utilizing video rear projection in many cases, but we're still shooting what the rear projection in 16 millimeter to make it look much older. And if you see some of his other films, I think a little bit later on, like The Forbidden Room, one of his more recent movies, it really creates a bizarre, dreamlike experience for the viewer. But anyway, back to My Winnipeg. As they're sitting there in 80 Ellis, they're also watching something called Ledge Man, a show that presumably was on for 50 years. And as I was looking online, I'm very curious to know, did Ledge Man really exist? Apparently a lot of archives were destroyed in the 90s. But again, starring Maddin's mother, I think we all at times play certain roles in our family's lives. And so these wonderfully Freudian moments are both hilarious in their dark way. I mean, who hasn't been blamed for giving their mother shingles at some point? But was Maddin really a model for Hudson's Bay Company? I can't tell. As Maddin admits, he lost track of what was true and what wasn't. He says in his quote, "I lied so vehemently, and because the lies come from me, there's an ecstatic truth that comes from it." And I think that's the core of mythology, is that these core stories, they grow and they build until they are an ecstatic truth. They are something that is a profound truth that is universal in many cases. So I think when I look at this this whole idea of Ledge Man, we're really getting into the psyche of our subject, I think, here a little bit. Another component to Maddin's films is also the utilization of melodrama to relate a realistic story. The lines between sister and mother in this scene where she's had an accident hitting a deer. I mean, this scene just knocks me out. It's, they're using it to relate a realistic story. But the lines, which again, by Tolles, he wrote the dialogue in the film. It's partly humorous, and then it becomes quite chilling, and we're taken aback at how the accusations fly about being engaged in a sexual tryst after a harrowing experience of being in an auto accident. How is mother the most clairvoyant person in Winnipeg? And you look at this blood-soaked hood of this car, and it keeps going back to the mythology early that he talks about, the blood and the fur of the city. So it's very, very peculiar stuff, very, very trippy. But then I was taken right back to Anne Savage's line deliveries from Detour, these quick, acidic-tongued line deliveries towards her daughter, and the things that she would say. I can't imagine a mother talking to their daughter like this. So I don't know how much of that is steeped in Guy's life, but or it doesn't really matter, as I mentioned before. And just as there may be a moment of clarity about the relationship between son and mother, we're pulled back into another city legend. We get into a bunch of wave of seances, streets named after brothel madams, a conflict between taxi companies that causes one taxi to have to use back lanes versus one that uses main streets, including a taxi blocking another taxi. I mean, it's relentless in the amount of storytelling that goes on in this film, I must say. But then as the dreamlike sequence they're all of a sudden out of nowhere. And I'm apologizing, couldn't find a really good image that represented the destruction and demolition. I apologize for that. But the dreamlike sequences they're jarred awake with modern footage of the Winnipeg Arena being dismantled. And it's a significant event as it represents a glorious past that's now, waning and dissolving into the sunset. And of course, for Guy Maddin, he writes, and in the film, of course, refers to it as a place of masculine awakening for our director. And he's describing the aroma of the shower rooms. You could almost smell it. If you're Canadian, you've got Canadian in your blood, you've got that smell of urine and sweat in your veins somehow. But it's also reminiscent of his feminine connections to past memories of his Aunt Lil's beauty salon and those wonderful descriptions that he portrays. If you don't remember them all, go back and watch those scenes. They're poetic. They're beautiful. And so, I know Fred was mentioning it before we got into the talk. I think I'm amazed at just how effortlessly this has been, I guess, turned into this tapestry. I mean, it's just how it's woven together so effortlessly. And so when we get to this point, I'm almost jarred out of what I've been watching. When we're looking at this old arena that is representative of the original six, it's kind of like when the Maple Leaf Gardens in Toronto was turned into a grocery store. The visceral reaction so many people had, I think, at that time. And so, but let's not forget as well that even beyond the sports, which is the glory days, that is like the gods in the arena. But it's also a place where he was presumably born, where his father had an incredible amount of purpose as the general manager of the Winnipeg Maroons, and he even credits after the Winnipeg goes to the NHL he even refers to how much of that took away the purpose of his father. So he has that connection, that visceral and emotional connection to it. And but his last victory is when the stadium is being demolished. That the old stadium still is afoot. Before the changes happen. It's to me, I don't know much about hockey. I'll be very frank, but it's rather poetic, I think. And of course, he still plays comedy in all of it when he refers to the destruction of that old Eaton Center and the empty center that was put in front of it, which is devoid of soul and character. And so I can't help but think, not to pull this back into the Westdale, but when you think about the Westdale Theater, that what could it potentially have become had it not been for what occurred in the past with, Fred and the group coming in and taking care of it. I know there was even a talk of it becoming a nightclub at one point. So, it's there's something about restoration that comes to mind here. But then we are pulled back into some other images. And then, I might say this is probably one of the most stark and mythological images in the entire movie. It's the first image I ever recall of watching My Winnipeg. It's the one that really stuck with me and I think sticks with so many people. If you get the Criterion edition Blu-ray of this, the painting that they've incorporated on the front page is this image. This image. And so when I first read about this and this image alone, like I said, it's a scene out of Greek mythology. What kind of Canadian curse could cause such an event? But this horrendous image, like most in Maddin's world, they go from dark and they turn into this sort of bitter, wonderful sense of humor. And as we find out, this would become a great public spectacle. To drag a line in from the movie, that we grow used to the sadness simply incorporated into our days, which, is what memory is. It's the fleeting memories that, it's sad, it's melancholy, but we kind of get used to it over time. And then he pivots very quickly. He doesn't want to remain too melancholy or too maudlin to from this poignant line to soon the Holly Snowshoe Club embarks on weekly jaunts out to the Horseheads and holds little jamborees there. Humans born to horses. So he goes from the sublime to the ridiculous. And it's my kind of humor. I really love it. As we begin to wrap up, as I mentioned earlier, at the beginning of this exercise, I started to try to research some facts from myth. And then I just had to ask myself, that's not the point of this film. The wonderful thing about myths is that there's always a component of truth in their stories. And what do we learn from them? But what I did find out is that If Day, which apparently every day is If Day in Winnipeg, but it turns out that If Day really was a thing to raise victory bonds in 1942, a facsimile of living under Nazi rule for the day. And it raised millions of dollars. They had these little sections of the entire province of Manitoba blocked off, and they had the military and actors and volunteers coming in. They brought in costumes from Hollywood to depict the Nazis taking over schools and buildings, and really, really. I mean, I think the one that I really looked at and thought, "There's no way that happened," is certainly the one that was true. So you never know. If you want to find out more about it, it's all over Google. But as we begin to wrap up, I'm going to leave us on this final image. And this is another gut punch in my opinion on this particular scene, and it's the voiceover narration on which Guy's contemplating who's alive anymore. It's so hard to remember. Sometimes I forget my brother Cameron's gone. I forget my father, and at some point. He says at some point the backgrounds and photos become more important than the people in them. And, I must confess again, like this scene, the montage that follows it from his personal film, personal movies as a child, where they're lounging on couches. It's almost an elegy on couches. It chokes me up when I see it. But I prefer to think of it as this entire movie is a wonderful gift from Guy Maddin to remind ourselves and to be okay with telling stories in our way. To, you might hook people if the stories are, a bit more poetic or a bit more mythological. So that's sort of my take on the film. I didn't get into too many of the technical aspects of the budget or anything of that nature. I just wanted to, get in and talk about my perspectives on what moved me about this movie, the ideas of mythology and dreams and interspersed with memory. And those are, if I can recommend more films from Guy Maddin, certainly The Saddest Music in the World is maybe one of the more accessible films, but certainly Archangel I just watched recently, and I think it's really excellent. And of course, Brand Upon the Brain is available out there as well. And so I just I'm going to end there. Next, I'd like to hand the podium to Fred and our special guest, Greg Klymkiw. While they have a conversation, just to remind you, please take the time to add your questions for Fred and Greg, and we will try to get to as many as we can in the time we have. So I'm just curious to know from you guys what you have to say, what your thoughts are, and what would you have to add? I'm sure you've got lots to say. So,
hi, Jeff. We're still on screen share?
Yeah, I'm just going to stop my share, and I'm going to put you guys up here.
Okay, terrific. Thank you, Jeff. That was just great. your passion, enthusiasm, and is just wonderful, wonderful. And I share much of it. So, hi, Greg, how are you?
Good, Fred. Hi, Jeff.
Been a while. We haven't, Greg and I met 20 years ago when I first moved here, and he was at the Canadian Film Center there teaching young filmmakers, and has been involved in many different aspects of the Canadian industry. And where are you, Greg? Maybe you could just explain for a moment. We're actually very fortunate to get him because he's somewhere where he's off the grid. So.
Well, I am off the grid. I have a home in the middle of a forest on the northern Bruce Peninsula, and it is really off the grid. There's no hydro, there's no internet other than on my phone, so I usually have to drive to a nearby village if I need Wi-Fi. So right now I'm stealing the Wi-Fi from the Bruce County Public Library in Lions Head.
Okay, well, thank you
so
very
far
much
it's working.
for making that effort. I'm mostly interested in talking to you about Guy when he first began to emerge as a filmmaker. And I know you worked very closely with him, but I do just have one last question about the film, because I've heard, and to me, one of the greatest things about the film was its poetry. It literally felt like a poem. I thought of it and I tried to think of something not unsimilar, and the closest I came was Under Milkwood by Dylan Thomas.
Oh, yeah.
And you think about the prose, poem, and imagery in the town. But I've heard that when the film first premiered, the Guy would actually appear in person and read the narration. Is that correct? Were there personal appearances?
Yeah, he did a series of personal appearances where he would, in fact, read the narration aloud.
Live, yeah.
Yeah, he would be live. And
I just love the concept of that, because to me that indicates a certain, breaking through some natural barriers between predetermined film narration, live narration, having the filmmaker whose mind this all came from there in person. Must have been extraordinary to see that. The energy must have been amazing.
No, it was pretty amazing. That I was actually at the world premiere screening at TIFF, and he was off to the side reading the narration, and they actually had a full team of Foley guys doing all of the sound and everything, and it was in the Elgin Garden Theater, and it was pretty fantastic. And I know there were a number of screenings throughout the world where Guy wouldn't do the live narration, but he would get special guests to do it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's also interesting.
Yeah.
And so what did people think when they saw this movie at that world premiere?
I mean, at the world premiere, the theater was packed, and I have to admit, Toronto Film Festival audiences are amazing. Like they're there to experience everything that is thrown at them, and that particular audience was unbelievable. I mean, people were you could feel an electricity in the air, and throughout most of the film, people were laughing pretty uproariously. So to have one of those huge theaters complete, I think, I can't remember whether it was the Elgin downstairs or the Winter Garden upstairs. One of the two, they're both huge, right? And it was completely packed. So to hear hundreds of people laughing uproariously.
Well, the only tragedy for me is watching the film sitting at home on my TV set, because I know that's not the way to have it, to experience it. But anyhow, so Greg, you grew up in Winnipeg. Are you more or less the same age as Guy, or you're a little older, or?
Yeah, Guy's got a couple of years on me, but we're basically the same age.
Yeah. How did you first meet each other, or how did you?
Well, it's really weird because, okay, this is funny because Guy's dad, of course, was the general manager of the Winnipeg Maroons, and the Winnipeg Maroons, of course, for a number of years, the Winnipeg Maroons during the 60s, insanely and inexplicably became Canada's national hockey team. And not only was Guy's dad was general manager of it, but my dad played goal on that team. My dad's an old goalie, right? He was with the Detroit Red Wings. Then he broke his ankle. And,
I never knew
Jack Adams gave him the little kiss off call and said, "Hey, I'm sorry to hear you broke your ankle. Best of luck to you, kid." And then my dad came to Winnipeg, and he became a cop and then a PR guy. But then he started playing hockey with the Maroons. So Guy's dad and my dad were really good friends.
That's amazing.
But Guy and I didn't know each other. We didn't meet till we were maybe 18 or 19 years old. Yeah, we became pretty good friends really quick because, of course, we discovered this ridiculous shared history of the old Winnipeg Arena and the Winnipeg Maroons and all kinds of stuff like that. So, yeah, it was, I guess.
And you were both, was he making films already, or what was he doing?
No, not at that time. He initially wasn't. His academic background, oddly enough, was in economics. But there was this sort of group of us who that included George Tolles, his longtime screenwriter, and we would often get together, and George would get 16 millimeter prints from the university, and we would sit there and watch movies together on a Bell and Howell auto load projector. You know, in our living room usually, and Guy and I became roommates, and we lived together for a number of years, and so.
And the passion for film was always there for both of you, and.
Oh yeah, I mean, just we really loved films, and there was sort of a burgeoning independent scene in Winnipeg in the 80s, before he began making films. I remember Guy and I going to some showing of local films at the Winnipeg Film Group, and Guy, I'll never forget this, and he wouldn't mind if I said this, but I remember when Guy just said, "I can't believe it. These filmmakers, they're surrounded by all these gorgeous women."
It's like being a musician, right? That's a good reason to get in the business.
He's like, "I should make films," you know. And then he went off and he made his first little short film, and then I don't know, from there, I don't know, we were roommates and pals, and I was
when did you first get a sense, though, that this guy was something special? You know, because there are a lot of people, I mean, your story is not unique, right? You know, people love film, but when did you first get a sense there was something really special going on here, or did it just evolve?
You know what? When I saw his short film, The Dead Father, it was obvious he was completely on another planet, and it was
Yeah.
another planet that I was happy to jettison myself to, right?
Right.
And yeah, one thing led to another, and we just ended up we did a lot of like slacking together, and then we
Sure, sure.
just sort of started making films together, and yeah.
And was there it did just
yeah,
sort of evolve.
it was
Yeah. And was there a moment
what's
when
that?
So it sounds like it did evolve, his talent, you working together, it was a period of time. And was there a moment when everybody sort of saw when he was discovered, or when, or was that also just evolutionary in a way? Or was there a big moment when you all kind of went, wait a second, we're not just doing this for fun, this is really whatever it is, art, this is, there's an audience for what we're doing,
Yeah, there were two moments that were sort of epiphanies in that sense. One was with Tales from the Gimli Hospital, because initially Tales from the Gimli Hospital was only 45 minutes long.
Right.
And it was called Gimli Saga. And he brought Steenbeck, where you're watching an actual work print, real film, and then a couple of tracks of sound going through. And I remember being kind of blown away by it, and I just said at that point, Guy, this is ridiculous. This is like 45 minutes long. It's not really gonna go anywhere. Can you figure out some idea, some way of making it a bit longer so that it's feature length?
Right.
And and then he said, oh, well, I was thinking of like just throwing in a bunch of stories about Gimli, Manitoba, and hence it became Tales from the Gimli Hospital. He just went and spent a few months, and we were just shooting stuff, and I don't know, just a lot of us, we'd be sitting around the apartment, and Guy would be like making cocoa for things, and we'd be sitting there, and he'd look around, and he'd go boom, boom, boom. He'd say, hey, there's enough of us here, let's just shoot something. And we'd go and we'd shoot a few scenes. It was pretty, the whole experience was pretty magical. And the fact that he would shoot his films without sync sound made it very, well, not easy, but it made it easier. Obviously, it was one less thing he had to worry about.
That's right.
All he had to do was set up a light,
and then
crank his Bull X, it was perfect.
Unbelievable.
So the other, I guess the other epiphany was after, and then Gimli Hospital, that actually, I kind of had a funny feeling it was gonna go through the roof. Like the entire budget of Gimli Hospital of the film was $22,000, and I ended up raising over $40,000 just to put together a marketing campaign. And that was a lot of fun.
Back then, sure.
Those were the days you could raise that kind of money just like that, and so the film did really well. But I do remember one time during Archangel, and again, it's funny, I always tried to make sure that, you know, we're making these movies for small amounts of money, so let's just take our time. And I remember, you know, with Archangel, we were editing up in the Winnipeg Film Group in one of the edit suites on a Steenbeck, and we would often go down the street to some greasy little spoon called Pat's Lunch. And I remember one day we were walking back to the edit suite, and Guy and I just stopped in the middle of the, you know, street, and he just looked at me and he said, "Greggy, we're doing this for real now, aren't we?" And I said, "Yeah,
wow,
we are." and
and
you know, so that was kind of a magical moment.
So you know, so people talk a lot about Canadian film and, you know, Canadian filmmakers, Canadian identity, blah 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 blah. How does Guy fit into that pantheon of Canadian filmmakers? Or, I mean, is that something he even ever thinks about, or is he just really doing, well, these are two separate questions. First of all, I'm curious about your opinion of where and how he fits within these this world. And then what does he think of all of it? He never left, he never went to Hollywood. I don't know if he ever had an opportunity or not, but he seems to be a bit of a unicorn, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I think he flirted with the Hollywood thing every so often. He'd go down there, but he didn't really like anything that was being offered to him. And he had his pick of projects.
Yeah.
He was actually even, at one point, they even wanted him to do the remake of The Omen. And
it was some studio film. They were going to hire him.
Yeah, cool. I can't do that. Oh. And so, I mean, I think where he fits in terms of the landscape of Canadian film, you've got to realize that I think when you look at sort of the history of English Canadian film, certainly around the time that we were starting to make all of our early films, there was actually quite an explosion of independent Canadian filmmakers. People like Patricia Rozema, people like Adam McGowan. Everyone seems to forget that Adam McGowan's first film cost $35,000.
Sure, no, everybody started. What was it, The Adjuster, or what was the first? Or before that?
No, his first film was called Next of Kin.
Oh, I've never seen that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's
anyhow, but you're right. It was an interesting period. Yeah.
It was really, really interesting right across the board, you know, and I think in a sense, Guy fit in perfectly with what I think a number of people have referred to as, you know, it really was a new wave of English Canadian cinema that started in the late 80s and continued through the think of people like Adam McGowan and Patricia Rozema and Peter Meckler. You know, I mean, you know, those people they were making pretty out there movies, and they were somehow capturing the attention of the world because the movies were so out there.
That's right. They were real, true art films. They were really personal expressions of an artist who had something to say, and was, you know, and sometimes they were books they were adapting, but they would bring a personal vision, and more like European filmmakers, or there are some American indie filmmakers as well, but not the people making studio films or mainstream films. And I always assumed, coming of course from the US, that, you know, unlike most people who wanted to talk about how horrible and difficult it was to be a Canadian filmmaker, I often thought, wow, you guys have it made up here. You got telefilm, you got tax credits, you got the NFB, you know, which I always, you know, admired the NFB tremendously when I was in the States, right? So I think that, I mean, in a sense, my intuition is that because there were these this kind of support, the artists were able to do more personal work, right? Versus if it was all being funded commercially.
Exactly, because in those days, a lot of this stuff wasn't funded. I mean, it wasn't funded commercially. Oh, I mean, eventually we would eventually get, pre-sale here, pre-sale there, but they were pretty minuscule.
Yeah,
pre-sale.
or Discovery Channel probably put up some money for My Winnipeg, but yeah.
Kind of thing, it was really tiny, and so it was a pretty, I would say, the late 80s and then all the way through the 90s, it was a pretty magical time to be doing independent films in Canada.
Yeah. Well, I completely agree. And it was amazing that Guy was part of it. Now, let me ask you one or two questions about being a Winnipegger, because you grew up there and everything else. And when I first moved to Canada, someone told me that all the really creative people either come from Winnipeg or Newfoundland. That it's so cold and dark that it encourages artistry and independent and abstract thinking. But I have really no sense of, I don't want to say the accuracy of this documentary in terms of its representation of the city, but I'm just, from your own perspective, did it capture it? Did it mean, what can you say from a more of a personal experience of growing up and living there?
I don't know. It feels like Winnipeg to me. I mean, when I first saw My Winnipeg, I was laughing with everybody else, but it was pretty amazing because it's funny. I feel, and I've talked about this before, but with My Winnipeg, I think there's on one hand the film, it works as this wonderful, poetic, artistic film, but on the other, it's, I think the personal vision is really important because, I actually think, I'll be honest with you, I think there are aspects of the film that, and it was funny. I remember even in the early days, we used to throw things in to those early films, even where it was like, there's like 6 people in the world who are going to really get any of this.
These days they call them Easter eggs,
and
those Easter eggs that only select people get to know.
I guess that's what they would call them. Yeah. Well, exactly, and it's sort of like even My Winnipeg.
Yeah, must have had a while.
There's a whole. There's a whole level of the film where I can assure you there's like 10 people in the world who
knows the references,
get certain things,
But it's that texturing, that I also thought it works as a documentary. I'm thinking, I didn't know that about Winnipeg. I never knew that, and so I'm learning all this. So, it's so many levels. I think you're so right, Greg. I think that's what really, really makes it work. And can I just ask you one more, and then we'll get Jeffrey and other people involved. What's Guy doing today? Where is his heads at? What kind of work is he interested in now? I know you said you saw him in the last couple of months, or?
Yeah, just because his mom actually just recently passed away, and we had we got together a couple of times, and then we had one little final session of tea together in his apartment, one sort of afternoon of just going over, just talking about the old days. But because, it's like sort of like, it was kind of wonderful because I did spend the past 3.5 years back in Winnipeg.
I know.
Which I never thought I would do. But
that's a story for another night.
Years, and so we spent a lot of time together, and it was.
So there's no film. There's no film on the go right now. There's no film he's in production on, or.
Well, he's trying to get another feature off the ground, obviously. Yeah. But what Guy always does is that he's been doing this for years now. When he's waiting for a feature film to get rolling, he just makes short films.
Yeah.
And he actually made this really wonderful short film called Stump the Guesser.
No kidding. Which,
oh yeah, it ended up having its world premiere at Berlin. It's like a little 20-minute long. It's completely insane.
So that's great. Yeah. Just keep.
Yeah, going. It was a real family affair too, And I remember, I'm in the film. He has a daughter in the film. It was like it was a lot of fun, and it was.
Does he have a team? That he works with a lot? The same editor or cameraman, or is there a whole little team?
I mean, he has a couple of people that he's gotten to start working with quite regularly in Winnipeg. He actually doesn't edit his own films anymore. A really great guy called John Gerdebeck has been editing his films the past few years. But even when he's working with an editor, his hand is there. He's also been working with a couple of really talented young co-directors, these crazy, the brothers Johnson, we call them.
Great.
Evan and Galen Johnson, who are these wonderful artists, real fine artists. So he works in collaboration with them.
That's great that he's passing it on. Mentoring new people.
Oh
yeah. All right, so we could talk. I mean, I could talk to you for hours, Greg, and we'll get in touch. But let's see what Jeff has to say, and if there are a couple of questions from the audience for you as well.
Well, I think the audience is rather wrapped, but if they do have questions, please bring them our way. But I was going to ask the stock actor, Louis Negin. Greg, do you have any thoughts or stories on him? I mean, he's so wonderful in so many of these movies. And by the way, if you're watching The Forbidden Room, or there's even a short that they extracted from it called How to Take a Bath, in which he plays a character named Marv. Just an interest, the years of character actors have sort of diminished. So to me, he just reminds me of that old tradition of character actors. Any thoughts on him? What do you know about him?
Yeah, Louis Negin is, he's a wonderful actor. And I think, he was doing a lot of theater and stuff like that. And I can't remember, I think it might have been, I can't remember. There was a journalist at the Toronto Star who was friends with Louis. And I remember she got in touch with me and said, how can I get in touch with Guy? I know this wonderful actor. Guy should meet him. And I think one thing led to another, and they ended up meeting together. And then Guy just ended up casting him in everything, absolutely everything. And Louis actually, Louis was actually in another former Winnipegger, Matthew Rankin, made this amazing film called The 20th Century.
Oh yeah, very good movie.
Yeah, and it's also it actually 20th Century is really influenced by. I was happy to see this in a way. It was highly influenced by Archangel, and he even I know Matthew he hired Louis to play a character called Mother So Louis in drag plays the mother. It's just insane.
That's wonderful.
Yeah. Louis a wonderful guy, and yeah, obviously I haven't seen him for a while. There's this thing called a pandemic.
Yeah, I know.
But Louis is really a great actor.
Yeah, he does stand above so many others. And I also heard you say that you've watched over 30,000 movies in your lifetime. And I'm just curious, after having, first of all, I don't know if you have an accounting background. I think that's pretty remarkable. But then I started doing the math too, and I'm like, I've got a long way to catch up here, Greg. So I think I'm only at about 10,500. But you got a couple of years on me. But I was going to say that when you're watching movies and you've had that many film experiences and you're a filmmaker, what turns you on now? Like, what have you seen in the last year in this pandemic that you'd say, seek that out?
TCM.
Oh yeah.
Right. That's the fallback.
No, but anything new? Is there anything new out there? Actually, there hasn't been much being released even, but
no, but I'm a big fan of Chloe Zhao, and I really loved Nomadland.
Yeah.
And I'm happy that I saw it a long time before all of the Oscar nonsense and the buzz and everything. And I really loved Nomadland.
He's a great director. Yeah.
I haven't seen a lot of new movies that I like very much.
Me either. It's. I think some of that is a function of COVID and everything else, and it's just a restless time. And let's face it, a lot of the best work is being done on television. A lot of the really good writers, and there's some interesting work being done that way as well. So let's see. So not much.
You know what? There are some. I mean, as per usual, there are some really great filmmakers outside of North America. I'm obviously, Parasite was an amazing movie.
A classic of the decade. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm blanking on his name, but there's a really great another Korean director. He made this absolutely terrifying film called Train to Busan. That is a brilliant film. And then he went and made a sequel called Peninsula, which is more of the same, basically zombies on a train.
Okay, I'm ready, Greg. I'm ready.
Sounds good to me,
Yeah, I'm with you, man.
It almost sounds like high concept, right? I mean,
but I always find that when people can take genre films and twist them and then imbue them with deeper mythology or character emotion, that's sometimes the most interesting thing of all is versus heavy dramas or heavy art stories kind of. Well, listen, this has been great, and Jeffrey, I think your talk was great. The images are great. Again, but at some point, email us, participants, let us know what you think, because again, do we want to do more of these kinds of films? Because we've been my preference is always Hollywood. I'll always default to the great Hollywood times and Hollywood movies. They're just so deeply in my blood and in my subconscious. But some people like Jeffrey are more interested in international film and experimental film and documentaries. And of course, we're all here to provide, what you, the audience, wants to see and wants to talk about. So feedback from you guys is really helpful, even if it's not in these Q&A. Now, Neil posted, Greg has a blog. So we're going to plug your blog, Greg, and anybody who wants to follow what he has to say about film is always interesting. And often it's, you just finished a thing on Westerns, right, that you were, obsessing about. And
you know what? I feel so bad because like I've been an arts administrator for 3.5 years, so I kind of put my film writing on hold, and
right.
but I'm going to try and do a little bit more of it. I really miss it.
Well, I've always enjoyed your writing. I always enjoy your perspective. You have a unique perspective usually, and you're honest and, and just sort of truthful about what you think and what you feel. And you're not just sort of following the crowd. And so I do hope you continue to write. I'm sure you will. And I think our audience at the Westdale would enjoy it. So please feel free to get that link, and we'll put it up on the website for everybody as well. So I think we'll wrap up, and then I do want to plug our next film for next Monday night. And I don't know why, I struggle with pronouncing it. I'll try it again. At the Nuet. Is that close, Greg?
Yeah, that sounds good to me.
The Fast Runner. So
I always pronounce the J, but that's probably wrong too. But
anyhow, it's absolutely an extraordinary film. It was done in 2001. It's an epic film, indigenous film. In fact, it's the first film. It's entirely filmed in the Inuktitut language, even though there's not actually a lot of dialogue in the film. It's very visual. It actually won international awards everywhere, premiered at the Cannes Film Festival. It actually won the Palme d'Or. I mean, it's just unbelievable, and I'm sure you would have thoughts about this too, Greg, but an extraordinary film and very important film within the indigenous community. And I've been communicating through my friend Loretta Todd, who did Monkey Beach, with Zach, and Zach may be able to join us next Monday. He's off on Baffin Island watching seal puppies being born or something, and so may not have internet access, or if his skidoo isn't working properly, but possibly one of his team will join us as well if he's not able to come himself. So please watch the film. Again, I wish you could see this on the big screen. That's a film that really needs to be seen on the big screen with the sound and the environment and everything, but do the best you can on television. It's all we have at the moment, unfortunately. We do believe we'll be opening end of July, beginning of August, so stay tuned. We have all sorts of wonderful plans for when the theater opens again. And
I might even come out to Hamilton for a drive. We
would love to have you, Greg. You can pick some film you want to show and talk about. It'll be a blast. We'll have a great time.
You know what, Hamilton, I have to say, Hamilton actually always reminded me of Winnipeg. It was sort of like Winnipeg, but like with lots of factories belching, pollution. But so Winnipeg plus that.
Well, they're both worker towns. They're towns with workers, and they were working towns. Exactly. Immigrant towns. I can see some of that. So anyhow, thank you all again for joining. Love your support. Donations always welcome, as you know, and look forward to seeing you all next week. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Greg. Very good talk. Great evening. See you all soon. Thank you so much.
Greg.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Hold on.